The crime boss received unnamed letters menacing him, but each came from the last person he'd imagine. The amber liquid caught the dying light filtering through the grimy windows of Vincent Torino's office, casting golden shadows across the mahogany desk that had witnessed more blood than most Chicago streets. Vincent's weathered hands, scarred from years of enforcing respect through violence, trembled slightly as he held the envelope. No postmark, no return address, just his name written in elegant script that seemed to mock him from the cream-colored paper. "Boss, you all right?" Tommy Marconi shifted nervously by the door, his hand instinctively moving toward the .38 tucked beneath his wool coat. The young enforcer had learned to read Vincent's moods like weather patterns, and tonight, storm clouds were gathering. Vincent's steel-gray eyes never left the letter. "Get out, Tommy. Tell the boys nobody disturbs me for the next hour." His voice carried the authority of a man who'd clawed his way from the South Side tenements to control half of Chicago's liquor trade. But underneath lay something Tommy had never heard before: uncertainty. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Vincent alone with ghosts and shadows. Outside, the October wind howled through the industrial maze of warehouses and speakeasies that formed his empire. Steam rose from manholes like the breath of a sleeping beast, and the distant clatter of elevated trains provided a rhythm to the city's pulse. Vincent broke the wax seal with deliberate slowness. The paper inside felt expensive, heavier than anything his usual enemies would use. His eyes scanned the words once, twice, 3 times before the meaning truly sank in. "Dear Vincent, you think concrete and steel can bury the past, but some graves refuse to stay covered. The boy who watched his father die still lives inside the monster you've become. Sleep well, knowing someone remembers what you've forgotten." A voice from the shadows. The letter fluttered to the desk as Vincent's hand went limp. 30 years of building walls around his heart, and somehow these words had found every crack. His father's face materialized in his mind. Giovanni Torino, shot down like a dog outside their tenement building in 1895 when Vincent was just 16. The image had motivated every brutal decision, every calculated move that built his criminal dynasty. Vincent poured another whiskey, the bottle's neck chattering against the glass rim. The letter lay there like a coiled snake, its words boring into his consciousness. Who could know? His rise from Giovanni's orphaned son to the Iron was a story he'd never told, not even to his closest lieutenants. The boy who'd sworn vengeance over his father's cooling corpse had died the night Vincent put 3 bullets in Patrick O'Malley, the Irish bastard who'd pulled the trigger. A knock interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "I said no interruptions." Vincent's voice cracked like a whip, but the door opened anyway. Maria Santos stepped inside, her emerald dress a splash of color against the office's masculine browns and grays. As his accountant and occasional lover, she was one of the few people who dared ignore his orders. "Vincent, darling, you look like you've seen a ghost." Her Spanish accent softened the edges of her concern as she moved toward him with feline grace. Maria had fled Mexico City 5 years ago with ledger books full of cartel secrets and a smile that could convince bishops to sin. She'd found sanctuary in Vincent's organization and had proven invaluable in laundering money through legitimate businesses. "Just business troubles," Vincent lied, sliding the letter beneath a stack of shipping manifests. But Maria's dark eyes caught everything, a survival skill honed by years of navigating dangerous men and their dangerous moods. She perched on the edge of his desk, close enough that he could smell her perfume, jasmine and something darker, more mysterious. "The boys are getting nervous downstairs. Word is the Castellanos are making moves on our South Shore operations. Tommy thinks we should hit them first, show strength." Vincent nodded absently, his mind still trapped in the letter's web. The Castellanos were a legitimate threat, recent immigrants from Sicily with old-world methods and new-world ambitions. But right now, bullets and bloodshed felt like distant concerns compared to the ghost someone had summoned from his past. "Tell Tommy to double the guards on our warehouses, but no moves against the Castellanos yet. I need time to think." Vincent's voice regained some of its usual steel, but Maria's trained eye caught the tremor in his hands. She leaned closer, her fingers trailing along his jaw. "Vincent, whatever's troubling you, you don't have to carry it alone. We're family here, remember? Family." The word hit like a physical blow. Vincent had built his organization on loyalty, on the bonds between men who'd bled together in the trenches of Chicago's gang wars. But family meant vulnerability, and vulnerability in his world meant death. He'd learned that lesson 30 years ago when Giovanni's blood had stained the cobblestones outside their apartment. "I'm fine, Maria. Just tired." He caught her hand, squeezed it gently, then released it. "Go home. It's late, and the streets aren't safe." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "Be careful, Vincent. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones we can't see coming." Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she left, each step echoing like a countdown. Alone again, Vincent retrieved the letter. The handwriting was feminine, educated, refined. Not the crude scrawl of a rival gang member or the desperate pleading of someone he'd wronged. This felt personal, intimate, like a lover's whisper turned venomous. He walked to the window overlooking his domain. Below, his soldiers moved through the shadows like pieces on a chessboard, protecting shipments of Canadian whiskey and ensuring tribute flowed from every speakeasy in their territory. Steam and smoke from countless chimneys created a low ceiling over the city, trapping the sense of industry, corruption, and ambition. Vincent Torino ruled this concrete jungle through fear and respect. But tonight, for the first time in decades, he felt like prey. Someone out there knew his deepest secret, understood the source of his strength, and had chosen to weaponize his own history against him. The letter burned in his hands like a brand, its message clear. The past was coming to collect its debts, and Vincent's carefully constructed world was about to face its greatest test. The Crimson Room buzzed with the energy of Prohibition-era excess, cigarette smoke mingling with expensive perfume, jazz music competing with whispered business deals, and the soft clink of glasses filled with liquor that officially didn't exist. Vincent Torino sat in his private booth, elevated above the main floor like a king surveying his court. But tonight, the familiar comfort of power felt hollow. 3 days had passed since the first letter, and sleep had become a stranger. Every shadow seemed to hide an accuser. Every whispered conversation might concern him. The second letter had arrived that morning, slipped under his apartment door while his bodyguard stood watch outside. The audacity of it made his blood boil. "Dear Vincent, did you think changing your name would change your nature? The scared boy who hid while his father died still makes every decision. Your empire is built on the foundation of your cowardice. How long before it crumbles?" A voice from the shadows. Vincent's knuckles whitened around his whiskey glass. The accusation of cowardice cut deeper than any blade. He'd been 16 when Giovanni died. What could a boy have done against 3 armed men? But guilt was a poison that ignored logic, and apparently, someone knew exactly which wounds to reopen. "Boss, we got problems." Tommy Marconi approached the booth, his usually confident swagger replaced by nervous energy. Behind him trailed Sal Benedetto, Vincent's enforcer, a mountain of a man whose scarred face told stories of countless street battles. Vincent gestured for them to sit, noting how both men scanned the crowd for threats. Paranoia was contagious in their world, and his recent behavior had infected his entire organization. "What kind of problems?" Tommy leaned closer, his voice barely audible above the band. 3 of our runners didn't show up for pickup today. Found Mickey Torello floating in the Chicago River this morning. 2 bullets in the head. Clean work, professional. "The Castellanos?" Vincent asked, though his heart wasn't fully in the question. The mysterious letters had consumed his focus, making everything else feel like background noise. Maybe. Or maybe it's connected to. Tommy hesitated, glancing around nervously. "Word on the street is someone's been asking questions about you, boss. Not recent stuff. Old stories. From before you became the Iron." Vincent's blood turned to ice water. "What kind of questions?" Sal shifted uncomfortably, his massive frame making the booth creak. "About your family, boss. About what happened to your old man. People are saying someone's been visiting the old neighborhood, talking to folks who knew you when you was just Vinny from the tenements." The Crimson Room suddenly felt suffocating. Vincent's carefully constructed identity was being excavated like an archaeological dig, each layer of protection stripped away by someone with intimate knowledge of his vulnerabilities. He stood abruptly, his movement causing conversations at nearby tables to pause. "Double security on all operations. Nobody moves alone. Nobody talks to strangers. And I want to know who's been asking questions about my family. Vincent's voice carried the cold authority that had built his reputation. But inside, the scared 16-year-old boy was screaming. 20 minutes later, Vincent found himself in the back alley behind the speakeasy, needing air that didn't taste of other people's secrets. The October night was bitter, turning his breath to vapor clouds that dissipated like the ghosts haunting his thoughts. Street lamps cast weak pools of yellow light, creating islands of visibility in an ocean of darkness. Footsteps echoed off the brick walls, steady and deliberate. Vincent's hand moved to the Colt .45 beneath his coat, but the figure that emerged from the shadows was familiar. Father Michael O'Connor, the Irish priest who'd somehow become confessor to half of Chicago's criminal element. "Vincent, my son, you look troubled." The priest's accent carried the music of Dublin, but his eyes held the wisdom of a man who'd seen humanity's darkest corners and still chose to believe in redemption. "Father, what brings you to my establishment? Surely the cardinal wouldn't approve of you visiting such dens of sin." Vincent's tone carried more warmth than he'd managed in days. Father O'Connor was neutral territory in Chicago's gang wars, ministering to Italian and Irish criminals with equal compassion. The priest smiled sadly. "Perhaps not, but Christ spent his time with tax collectors and sinners. Did he not? I heard you might need counsel." Vincent almost laughed. If only the priest knew about the letters, about the way his past was reaching across 30 years to drag him back into darkness. "I'm beyond salvation, Father. Some sins are too heavy for even God's forgiveness." "Nonsense. I've known you for 5 years, Vincent. Beneath all that armor, you're still the boy who lights candles for his father every Sunday at St. Anthony's. Don't think I haven't noticed." The observation hit like a physical blow. Vincent had thought those private moments of remembrance were secret, his weekly tribute to Giovanni's memory hidden from the world that knew him as a heartless killer. "You know nothing about my father. I know he died when you were young. I know you've spent your adult life trying to prove you're nothing like the frightened boy who couldn't save him. And I know someone's been stirring up those old memories, judging by the shadows under your eyes." Father O'Connor stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Vincent, sometimes the greatest courage is admitting we're afraid. Your father wouldn't want you carrying this burden of guilt forever." Before Vincent could respond, a gunshot cracked through the night air. Instinctively, both men dropped behind a parked automobile as more shots followed, bullets sparking off brick walls and shattering windows. Vincent drew his pistol, scanning for muzzle flashes while his mind raced through possibilities. The Castellanos, rival gangs, or maybe whoever was sending the letters had escalated to direct action. "Stay down, Father." Vincent spotted movement on a fire escape across the alley. 2 figures, one with a rifle, the other providing cover with a handgun. Professional positioning, military precision. These weren't street thugs or rival gangsters. Vincent returned fire, his bullets chewing chunks from the brick wall as the shooters retreated upward. The rifle cracked again, the bullet passing close enough to his ear that he felt its wind. Then, as suddenly as it began, the shooting stopped. Footsteps pounded across rooftops, fading into the urban maze. In the sudden silence, Vincent helped Father O'Connor to his feet, checking the priest for injuries. "Are you hurt?" "No, but you are." The priest pointed to Vincent's left arm, where blood was seeping through his coat sleeve. A bullet had grazed him without his notice, adrenaline masking the pain. As Tommy and Sal burst through the speakeasy's back door with guns drawn, Vincent's mind focused on a chilling realization. The shooters had positioned themselves perfectly to pin him in the alley, but their escape route suggested they knew the neighborhood's rooftops intimately. This wasn't random violence or a territorial dispute. It was targeted, planned, and executed by someone who understood both his habits and the geography of his domain. The letters weren't just psychological warfare anymore. Someone was escalating from words to bullets, and Vincent realized with growing dread that his mysterious tormentor might be closer than he'd ever imagined. In a world where trust was currency and betrayal meant death, someone in his inner circle was playing a game that could destroy everything he'd built. The scared 16-year-old boy was no longer just a memory. He was back, and this time, he might not survive what was coming. The safe house on the north side had been Vincent's refuge for 3 years, a modest brownstone that looked like any other in the working-class neighborhood. unremarkable and invisible. Now, with his arm in a sling and paranoia eating at his gut like acid, it felt more like a tomb. Rain hammered against the windows, turning the October night into a study in gray and shadow. Vincent paced the small living room, his good hand gripping the third letter that had arrived just hours after the shooting. The message was shorter this time, but infinitely more threatening. Dear Vincent, blood recognizes blood, but you've forgotten the difference between family and enemy. Tonight you learned that safety is an illusion. Tomorrow you'll learn that trust is a weapon. The boy who failed his father will fail everyone else. A voice from the shadows. Maria Santos sat at the kitchen table, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled from the night's chaos. She'd insisted on coming to tend his wound, ignoring his protests about safety. Now she watched him pace with growing concern, her dark eyes tracking his movement like a cat watching a cornered mouse. Vincent, you need to rest. The bullet barely grazed you, but infection is still a risk. Her voice carried the no-nonsense tone she used when managing his legitimate businesses, but underneath lay something else. Fear, perhaps, or calculation. Rest? Vincent's laugh was bitter. Someone tried to kill me tonight, Maria, someone who knows my movements, my habits, my history. How can I rest when there's a traitor in my own organization? Tommy Marconi emerged from the basement where he'd been checking the building's security. His young face was grim, aged by the responsibilities Vincent had thrust upon him. Perimeter's secure, boss. Sal's watching the front, Joey's covering the back alley. But Vincent, he hesitated. The informality of using his boss's first name unprecedented. "Do say what's on your mind, Tommy. The shooters tonight, they weren't random. The positioning, the timing, the escape route. Whoever planned this knows our operations inside and out. It has to be someone close." Vincent stopped pacing, his steel gray eyes scanning the room. Maria at the table, her fingers nervously turning her coffee cup. Tommy by the basement door, his hand never far from his gun. Both of them had access to his schedule, his safe houses, his vulnerabilities. Both knew enough of his history to understand which buttons to push. The realization hit him like ice water in his veins. One of them was his tormentor. "Maria, when did you last visit the old neighborhood?" Vincent's voice was deceptively casual, but his body had shifted into the predatory stillness that preceded violence. Her eyes widened slightly. "The old neighborhood? Vincent, why would you ask such a thing? Answer the question." Maria's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing something desperate underneath. Sometimes I drive through Little Italy when I need to think. The streets remind me of Mexico City, of home, but I've never bothered anyone there, never asked questions about your past." Vincent studied her face, searching for tells. Maria was skilled at deception. It had kept her alive through the cartels and the early days in Chicago. But even she couldn't hide everything. "And you, Tommy? Any reason to visit my old stomping grounds?" Tommy's hand moved closer to his gun, a reflexive action that didn't go unnoticed. "Boss, you're starting to sound paranoid. We're your people, your family. We'd never betray you. Family." There was that word again, the one that had haunted Vincent since the first letter. He'd built his organization on the fiction of family loyalty, but blood family was different from chosen family. Blood family knew your secrets from birth, understood your weaknesses with intimate precision. "Tommy, tell me about your grandmother." The young man's face went pale. What does she have to do with anything?" "Your grandmother, Lucia Marconi. She lived on Mulberry Street in the 1890s, didn't she? Same block as my family." Vincent's voice was gaining momentum, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "Old Italian ladies have long memories, don't they? They remember every birth, every death, every scandal in the neighborhood." Tommy's hand was on his gun now, but he hadn't drawn it yet. "Vincent, you're talking crazy. My nonna's been dead for 2 years, but not before she told you stories. Stories about the Torino family, about little Vincenzo who watched his father die and did nothing to stop it." Vincent's voice was deadly quiet now, each word dropping like stones into still water. Maria was rising from her chair, her own hand moving toward the small pistol she kept in her purse. The kitchen suddenly felt like a powder keg with 3 lit fuses. "Vincent, stop this. You're letting paranoia destroy your judgment." But Vincent was remembering now, details that had seemed insignificant suddenly blazing with meaning. Tommy's hiring 5 years ago, Recommended by whom? His grandmother, who'd known the family, who'd spoken highly of young Marconi's potential, his rapid advancement in the organization, his access to every operation, every secret. Your grandmother told you about my father's death, didn't she, Tommy? About how I hid in the apartment while Giovanni died in the street. About how the other boys called me a coward. Tommy's face crumpled, years of careful deception finally breaking under pressure. She used to tell stories about the old days, about families that rose and fell, about boys who became men and men who became monsters. The gun was in Tommy's hand now, but he wasn't pointing it at Vincent yet. Instead, his eyes held a mixture of pain and rage that Vincent recognized. It was the same expression he'd seen in his own mirror for 30 years. She said you killed 3 innocent men to cover your shame. Patrick O'Malley wasn't a murderer. He was a delivery boy for the local grocer. Wrong place at the wrong time. But you needed someone to blame for your father's death, someone to punish for your cowardice. The words hit Vincent like physical blows. O'Malley. He'd never questioned the story that painted the Irishman as a rival gang member. In his grief and rage, he'd accepted the version of events that allowed him to act, to transform helplessness into violence. The other 2 men you killed that night, they were just witnesses who could expose your mistake. 3 innocent lives to feed your guilt. Tommy's voice was breaking, the weight of years of deception and rage finally spilling over. Maria was backing toward the door, her survival instincts overriding loyalty. But Vincent barely noticed her movement. His entire worldview was collapsing. 30 years of justified violence revealed as elaborate self-deception. So you came to work for me to, what? Get justice, get revenge. Tommy's gun finally swung toward Vincent, tears streaming down the young man's face. I came to understand you, to see if the monster matched the man. And for 5 years, I watched you order deaths, destroy families, spread misery through this city, all to feed your guilt over being human, over being afraid. The rain pounded harder against the windows, as if the sky itself was weeping for the sins being confessed in the little brownstone. Vincent realized with crushing clarity that Tommy was right about O'Malley, about the witnesses, about the guilt that had driven every brutal decision of his adult life. But understanding didn't equal forgiveness. And in Chicago's underworld, there was only one way conflicts like this ended. Vincent's hand moved toward his gun, and Tommy's finger tightened on his trigger. Outside, thunder rolled across the city like the sound of falling empires, and 2 men who'd called each other family prepared to add more blood to Chicago's endless account. The standoff lasted only seconds, but in that frozen moment, Vincent Torino saw his entire life laid bare. 30 years of violence, power, and carefully constructed lies crumbling like ancient mortar. Tommy's finger was tight on the trigger, his young face twisted with years of suppressed rage and moral anguish. Behind them, Maria had vanished through the back door, her survival instincts choosing flight over loyalty. You want to kill me, Tommy? Go ahead. Pull the trigger and finish what your grandmother started with her stories. Vincent's voice was eerily calm, resignation replacing the fear that had consumed him for days. But answer one question first. What happens after I'm dead? Tommy's hand trembled slightly, but the gun remained steady. Justice happens. The families you've destroyed get peace. The city gets 1 less monster. Justice. Vincent's laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. Good boy. You've been in this business 5 years. You've seen how this world works. You kill me tonight, and by dawn, the Castellanos will be carving up my territory. The Irish will move in from the docks. Every small-time operator will try to grab a piece of what I built. The rain continued its relentless assault on the windows, each drop like a tick of a clock counting down to inevitable violence. Vincent could hear Sal moving outside, probably responding to Maria's warning. But the big enforcer wouldn't act without orders. This was between family now. You think killing me makes you a hero, Tommy. You think your grandmother's ghost will rest easier. All you'll accomplish is turning Chicago into a war zone. Innocent people will die. More innocent people than I ever killed. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Tommy's eyes. Vincent pressed his advantage, not with threats but with truth. I've been thinking about those letters, about the boy who watched his father die. You're right, I was a coward that night, 16 years old, terrified, hiding behind my mother's skirts while Giovanni bled out in the street. Vincent moved slowly toward the window, his hands visible, non-threatening. But you know what I learned in 30 years of trying to prove I wasn't that scared boy? Courage isn't the absence of fear, Tommy. It's acting despite the fear. And right now, you're more afraid than I am. Shut up, Tommy's voice cracked, but he didn't fire. You don't get to philosophize your way out of this. You don't get to make me doubt. Your grandmother filled your head with stories of justice and revenge, but she never told you the whole truth, did she? Vincent turned from the window, his gray eyes holding Tommy's gaze. So she never told you what happened to my mother after Giovanni died. The question caught Tommy off guard. His grandmother had spoken of the Torino tragedy, but always focused on Vincent's cowardice, his transformation into a criminal. The aftermath, the human cost beyond her moral tale, had been lost to narrative convenience. Maria Torino worked herself to death trying to keep us fed after Giovanni was gone. Scrubbing floors, taking in laundry, selling everything we owned piece by piece. She died of pneumonia when I was 18. Pneumonia she caught because she couldn't afford proper medicine, proper food, proper shelter. Vincent's voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he spoke. Every brutal thing I've done since then, I've done to ensure no one in my organization ever faces that kind of desperation. My soldiers, families are protected, their children educated, their futures secure. Is that justice for my crimes, Tommy? Maybe not, but it's something. Tommy's gun wavered, confusion replacing certainty. That doesn't erase what you did to O'Malley, to those other men. No, it doesn't. Vincent reached slowly into his jacket, not for his gun but for a worn photograph. This is Patrick O'Malley's family, his wife Sarah, his daughter Catherine. I've been sending them money every month for 25 years. Anonymous payments that paid for Catherine's education, Sarah's medical bills, their home. The photograph fluttered to the floor between them, a faded image of a woman and child, smiling and unaware their patriarch would die for another man's guilt. It doesn't bring him back, but it's what I could do. What I chose to do with the power his death helped me build. Tommy stared at the photograph, his worldview fracturing. The black and white narrative his grandmother had fed him, monster versus victims, was revealing shades of gray he'd never considered. You've been supporting them, and the families of the other two men, and a dozen other families whose breadwinners died because of my orders over the years. It's not absolution, Tommy. It's acknowledgement. It's carrying the weight instead of pretending it doesn't exist. Outside, footsteps echoed in the alley. Sal's voice called out, probably checking on his boss. Vincent ignored the distraction, focused entirely on the young man whose crisis of faith might determine both their fates. Your grandmother was right about one thing. I am a monster, but monsters can choose what they do with their teeth and claws. I built an organization that protects its own, that keeps territorial wars from spilling innocent blood, that maintains order in a chaotic world. Is that redemption? Probably not, but it's better than the alternative. Tommy's tears had stopped, but his face remained twisted with internal conflict. Why didn't you tell me any of this? Why let me believe you were just another heartless killer? Because heartless killers are predictable. They're easier to manage, easier to understand. But men carrying guilt, men trying to balance scales that can never truly balance. We're dangerous in different ways. We make desperate choices, unpredictable moves. Vincent gestured toward the letters scattered on the kitchen table. Like these, whoever's been playing games with my psyche understood that guilt was my weakness. They knew exactly which wounds to reopen, which fears to exploit. Tommy followed his gaze, realization dawning. But I wrote those letters. Did you? All of them? Vincent's voice sharpened. Because the handwriting was feminine, the paper expensive. The psychology was sophisticated, targeted. You might have been inspired to write them, Tommy, but I don't think you were working alone. As if summoned by his words, Maria's voice drifted from the back door. Very perceptive, Vincent, though it took you longer than I expected to figure it out. She stepped back into the kitchen, no longer the frightened woman seeking escape. Her posture was different, confident, predatory. Behind her came two men Vincent didn't recognize, professional gunmen with the cold eyes of experienced killers. Maria. Vincent's voice held genuine surprise and hurt. Of all the betrayals he'd imagined, this one had never occurred to him. Zeddy, did you really think I fled Mexico City just to keep books for a Chicago crime boss? Her Spanish accent was gone, replaced by something flatter, more American. The Torino organization has been very useful for laundering cartel money, but your psychological stability was becoming a liability. My employers decided you needed to be managed. Tommy's gun swung toward Maria, but one of her gunmen was faster, putting 2 bullets in the young man's chest before he could fire. Tommy collapsed, his grandmother's stories of justice dying with him in a pool of spreading blood. Vincent felt something break inside him as Tommy fell. Not fear, not anger, but a profound sadness for all the choices that had led to this moment. The scared 16-year-old boy who'd watched his father die was finally quiet, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. So Tommy was just a convenient weapon. Vincent's voice was calm, but his hand was moving toward his gun with practiced smoothness. A useful tool who outlived his purpose. The letters served their function. They made you doubt yourself, question your judgment, isolate yourself from your organization. Now we can restructure things more efficiently. Vincent's Colt was in his hand before Maria finished speaking, but her gunmen were already moving. Bullets shattered the kitchen window, embedded themselves in walls, splintered furniture. Vincent dove behind the overturned table, returning fire with methodical precision. In the chaos of gunfire and breaking glass, one thought echoed in Vincent's mind. He'd spent 30 years trying to prove he wasn't the coward who'd failed his father. Tonight, surrounded by enemies who'd manipulated his guilt into a weapon, he finally understood the difference between being afraid and being broken. The boy who'd hidden during his father's murder was gone. In his place stood a man who'd finally learned that some debts could only be paid in blood. The gunfight lasted less than 3 minutes, but it rewrote the landscape of Vincent Torino's world. When the smoke cleared, Maria lay motionless by the shattered back door, her deception finally silenced by Vincent's methodical marksmanship. One of her gunmen had escaped through the basement, but the other would never leave the brownstone's blood-stained kitchen. Vincent knelt beside Tommy's body, the young man's eyes staring sightlessly at the water-damaged ceiling. In death, Tommy looked even younger, the lines of hatred and internal conflict smoothed away. Vincent closed the boy's eyes with surprising gentleness, a gesture that would have seemed impossible from Chicago's most feared crime boss just hours earlier. Boss, are you alive?" Sal's voice boomed through the front door, followed by the sound of splintering wood as the big enforcer forced his way inside. He appeared in the kitchen doorway with gun drawn, taking in the carnage with professional assessment. "I'm alive, Sal, but we've got work to do." Vincent rose from beside Tommy's corpse, his voice carrying new authority. Not the brittle hardness he'd worn like armor for 30 years, but something deeper and more genuine. "Get Joey to help you clean this up. And send word to all our lieutenants. Emergency meeting in 1 hour at the warehouse." Sal nodded, already reaching for his phone. "What about the Castellanos? Word is they're mobilizing, expecting us to be weak after tonight's shooting." "Let them come." Vincent retrieved the scattered letters from the floor, studying them with new understanding. Maria was right about one thing. Psychological warfare is more effective than bullets. Time to remind Chicago why they call me the Iron. An hour later, the abandoned meatpacking warehouse on the south side buzzed with nervous energy. Vincent's top lieutenants had gathered in the cavernous space, their faces reflecting confusion and concern. Rumors of the night's violence had spread quickly through the organization's ranks, mutating with each telling until nobody knew what to believe. Vincent stood before them on the loading dock, elevated like a judge addressing a court. The harsh electric lights cast deep shadows across his weathered face, and his left arm remained in its sling from the previous night's shooting. But his presence filled the warehouse with unmistakable authority. "Gentlemen, tonight we learned that trust is a luxury we can't afford." Vincent's voice carried clearly through the space, every word calculated for maximum impact. Tommy Marconi and Maria Santos were working with outside interests to destabilize our organization. They're both dead now, but their betrayal revealed vulnerabilities we need to address. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several lieutenants shifted uncomfortably. Vincent's inner circle had been shattered, and everyone was calculating their own position in the new order. Big Eddie Toretto, Vincent's oldest surviving ally, stepped forward. "Yubby boss, if we can't trust our closest people, who can we trust?" How do we know there aren't other traitors in the room right now? Vincent smiled for the first time in days, but there was no humor in it. Eddie, that's exactly the right question, and I have exactly the right answer. He gestured toward the warehouse's rear entrance, where Father O'Connor emerged from the shadows, still wearing his priest's collar despite the late hour. Gentlemen, Father O'Connor will be conducting individual confessions with each of you over the next week. Not religious confessions, business confessions. Every detail of your operations, your loyalties, your concerns about this organization. The Father will report directly to me. The warehouse erupted in protests. Using a priest as an intelligence gatherer crossed lines that even hardened criminals respected. But Vincent's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Anyone who has a problem with this arrangement is free to leave Chicago permanently. Tonight, anyone who stays accepts the new rules. Vincent's gray eyes swept the room, cataloging faces, measuring reactions. We're no longer just a criminal organization, gentlemen. We're at war. Father O'Connor looked uncomfortable with his role but didn't protest. Vincent had made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Protection for St. Anthony's orphanage in exchange for his unique services. In a city where even priests needed patrons, moral compromise was often the price of survival. The Castellanos think tonight's chaos makes us vulnerable, Vincent continued, his voice gaining momentum. They're planning to move on our South Shore operations within 48 hours. Intelligence suggests they've allied with remnants of the O'Malley crew. Yes, Patrick O'Malley's surviving relatives have been nursing grudges for 25 years. The irony wasn't lost on Vincent. The innocent man he'd killed in his grief-fueled rage had family too, brothers and cousins who'd spent decades planning their own revenge. His past wasn't just haunting him through guilt anymore. It was actively trying to destroy his future. But here's what our enemies don't understand. Vincent stepped down from the loading dock, moving among his men like a general inspecting troops. Tonight, I remembered something I'd forgotten. I remembered why I survived when stronger men didn't, why I built this organization when others fell apart. He stopped in front of little Tony Castellino, a young soldier barely older than Tommy had been. Tony, tell me, what makes a man dangerous? The young man swallowed nervously. Guns, boss, money, connections? Wrong. Vincent's voice was patient but firm. Fear makes a man dangerous. Not being afraid, that's stupidity. But understanding your fear, accepting it, and acting anyway, that's power. Vincent pulled out a photograph, not the O'Malley family picture from earlier, but an older image showing a 16-year-old boy standing beside a fresh grave. His own face stared back at him across 30 years, young and terrified but already showing the steel that would define his future. For 30 years, I've been running from this boy, trying to prove I wasn't him, trying to bury him under reputation and violence, but tonight I learned something. He's not my weakness, he's my strength. Vincent tucked the photograph away, his movements deliberate and symbolic. The scared boy who watched his father die grew up to build the most powerful criminal organization in Chicago, not despite his fear, but because of it. He understood that every choice has consequences, every action ripples outward, every death diminishes us all. Big Eddie stepped forward again, his scarred face reflecting confusion. Boss, I don't understand. Are you saying we should be afraid? I'm saying we should be smart. Fear keeps you alive, Eddie. It makes you careful, makes you think before you act. But guilt, Vincent's voice hardened. Guilt makes you reckless. It makes you seek punishment, makes you believe you deserve whatever happens to you. Vincent walked to the warehouse's windows, looking out at the city lights stretching toward Lake Michigan. Steam rose from manholes and factory chimneys, creating an urban fog that softened the harsh edges of the industrial landscape. Somewhere out there, the Castellanos were planning their move, convinced that Vincent's organization was vulnerable. Maria and Tommy thought they could use my guilt as a weapon. They were right, for a while. But guilt is just fear pointed backward, regret for things that can't be changed. Tonight, I'm pointing my fear forward, toward things I can still influence. He turned back to his assembled lieutenants, and they saw something different in his eyes. Not the desperate hardness of a man trying to prove himself, but the calm confidence of someone who'd finally accepted who he was. Tomorrow, we end the Castellano threat permanently. not through random violence or territorial displays, but through surgical precision. We dismantle their operation piece by piece, eliminate their leadership, and absorb their soldiers. Clean, efficient, final. Vincent's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the warehouse's acoustics, every word carried clearly. And after we finish with the Castellanos, we're going to find every remaining member of the O'Malley clan and offer them a choice. Join us or leave Chicago. No more blood feuds, no more generational vengeance. The sins of the fathers end with this generation. The warehouse fell silent except for the distant sounds of the city, train whistles, car horns, the eternal rhythm of urban life. Vincent's men exchanged glances, processing this new version of their leader. The volatile, guilt-driven boss they'd known was being replaced by something more dangerous, a calculating strategist who'd made peace with his own history. Boss, little Tony raised his hand tentatively. What about the letters? What if there are more enemies we don't know about? Vincent smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. Tony, my boy, let me tell you something about psychological warfare. It only works if your target is afraid of the truth being revealed. But I just told you all my deepest secrets, my greatest shames, my most carefully guarded vulnerabilities. He spread his arms wide, encompassing the warehouse and the men within it. What power do hidden truths have over a man who's already confessed everything? What leverage do guilt and shame provide against someone who's accepted his nature? The transformation was complete. Vincent Torino, not the Iron, not the guilt-driven monster, but simply Vincent, stood before his organization as a man who'd finally learned the difference between strength and brutality, between fear and wisdom. Gentlemen, the boy who watched his father die in 1895 just grew up, and Chicago is about to learn what that means. Outside, the October wind carried the scent of coming snow, the promise of winter and change. The city's underworld was about to be reshaped by a man who'd finally stopped running from his past and started building something worthy of his father's memory. The scared 16-year-old was finally at peace. In his place stood a leader who understood that true power came not from hiding your wounds, but from learning to carry them with dignity. The letters had intended to destroy Vincent Torino. Instead, they'd forged him into something more dangerous than his enemies had ever imagined. A man with nothing left to hide and everything left to protect. As his lieutenants filed out to prepare for the coming war, Vincent remained alone in the warehouse, holding the photograph of his younger self. Tomorrow would bring violence, but tonight brought something rarer in his world: understanding, acceptance, and the quiet confidence that came from finally knowing who you were. The iron had been broken and reforged, and Chicago would never be the same. The Chicago Tribune's morning edition carried a small item on page 6. Castellano crime family dismantled. Federal authorities, acting on anonymous tips, arrested 12 members of the Castellano organization in coordinated raids across the city. Family patriarch Giuseppe Castellano was found dead in his lakeshore apartment, apparently of natural causes. Vincent folded the newspaper with satisfaction. The reality had been more complex. Surgical strikes against Castellano warehouses, key lieutenants offered choices between exile and bullets, and Giuseppe's natural death, hastened by a pillow held over his face by his own nephew, now working for Vincent. The surviving O'Malley relatives had been easier to handle. A meeting in neutral territory, mediated by Father O'Connor, had resulted in an understanding. Vincent's admission of guilt, combined with a substantial trust fund for Patrick's surviving nieces, had ended a 25-year blood feud with handshakes instead of gunfire. Maria Santos's body had been found in Lake Michigan 3 days after the warehouse meeting, officially listed as a drowning. The lone surviving Sinaloa gunman had been less fortunate. His remains were now part of the foundation of a new speakeasy on the south side. Vincent sat in his restored office, the bullet holes patched, the bloodstains scrubbed away. On his desk lay a single envelope, not a threatening letter this time, but a wedding invitation from Catherine O'Malley, Patrick's daughter who'd grown up on Vincent's anonymous payments. She was marrying a doctor and wanted to thank the family friend who'd supported her education. Tommy Marconi's funeral had been attended by 200 people, the official story being that he died defending his boss from cartel assassins. Vincent had delivered the eulogy himself, speaking truthfully about a young man's search for justice, even if that search had been misguided. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." Father O'Connor entered, carrying a small wooden box. "The assessments are complete, Vincent. 11 men judged completely trustworthy, 3 with minor concerns that can be addressed through reassignment, and 1," he paused. "One what?" "One man who never showed up for his conversation. Disappeared the day after your warehouse meeting." Vincent nodded grimly. The escaped cartel gunman, probably, or another plant he hadn't identified. There would always be threats, always be enemies plotting in the shadows. But now he faced them with clear eyes and honest purpose, no longer driven by guilt, but guided by responsibility. "Thank you, Father." And the orphanage. Thriving. 50 children eating well, learning their letters, staying off the streets. Some good has come from all this darkness. After the priest left, Vincent walked to his window overlooking the city. Steam still rose from manholes and factory chimneys. Trains still rattled overhead, and somewhere in the maze of streets and alleys, other scared children were watching their fathers die. But now Vincent Torino knew the difference between hiding from fear and learning from it. The boy who'd watched Giovanni die had finally grown into a man who could protect other families from the same fate. He pulled out a sheet of expensive paper, the same type that had once carried threats, and began to write. "To whoever comes next, power built on guilt crumbles eventually, power built on purpose endures. The boy who failed his father learned to save other sons. Remember that when you face your own ghosts." Vincent Torino, Chicago, 1925. He sealed the letter in his safe, a message for the future that would never need to be sent. Outside, the city hummed with the energy of ambition and corruption, dreams and nightmares. But inside the office of Chicago's most powerful crime boss, there was finally peace. The Iron had learned that true strength came not from burying the past, but from carrying it with honor. And Chicago, unknowing, slept a little safer because a scared 16-year-old boy had finally forgiven himself for being human.